Solomon Islands, February 13, 1943. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai had survived more combat than any pilot should. His Zero danced through the tropical air above Guadalcanal with the grace of a samurai's blade, lightweight, responsive, a natural extension of his will. Below, the jungle canopy stretched endlessly green, broken only by the muddy scars of American airstrips. Then he heard it, a sound unlike anything else in the Pacific theater, a deep, resonant howl that seemed to tear through the sky itself. The Americans called it the Whistling Death, though Sakai didn't know that yet. What he knew was that his wingman had just exploded in a ball of orange flame, and diving toward him at impossible speed was the strangest aircraft he'd ever seen. It looked wrong, malformed. Its wings bent upward at sharp angles like a gull caught mid-stroke, and its massive nose housed an engine that seemed too large for the fuselage. This couldn't be the nimble opponent he was used to. This was something else entirely. Sakai banked hard, expecting the ungainly beast to overshoot. Instead, it followed him into the turn with shocking precision, its .650 caliber machine guns stitching the air where he'd been a heartbeat before. He dove. The bent-wing fighter dove faster. He climbed. It climbed higher, engines screaming. For the first time in his distinguished career, Saburo Sakai felt something unfamiliar in aerial combat: inadequacy. The F-4U Corsair had arrived. The story begins not with glory, but with desperation. In February 1938, the United States Navy issued a request for proposal that would reshape aerial warfare. They wanted a single-seat fighter capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour. At the time, this was an almost absurd requirement. The fastest fighters in the world struggled to reach 350 mph. The Navy wasn't just asking for incremental improvement, they were demanding a quantum leap. Chance Vought Aircraft Corporation, based in Stratford, Connecticut, accepted the challenge. Chief designer Rex Beasel and his team understood immediately that conventional approaches wouldn't suffice. To reach 400 mph, they needed the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder behemoth producing 2,000 horsepower. But power created problems. The R2800 required a massive propeller over 13 feet in diameter to convert its raw power into thrust. Such a large propeller needed significant ground clearance, which typically meant longer landing gear. Longer landing gear meant more weight and structural complexity, especially the sturdy retractable gear required for carrier operations. Beisel's solution was elegant and unconventional: the inverted gull wing. By bending the wing downward at the fuselage and then sweeping it upward, the designers could attach shorter, lighter landing gear directly at the wing's lowest point, the knuckle where it bent. This configuration provided the necessary propeller clearance without the weight penalty of extended struts. The bent wing also created ideal junctures for the landing gear, reducing stress on the wing structure. There was an aerodynamic bonus, too. The inverted gull design allowed the wings to meet the fuselage at nearly a right angle, reducing drag at the crucial wing root junction. It was brilliant engineering, but it looked bizarre. Gurnash Bursham. Paper promise to metal monster. The prototype XF4U-1 first flew on May 29, 1940, with Vought's chief test pilot Lyman A. Bullard Jr. at the controls. The results were immediate and spectacular. On October 1, 1940, the Corsair became the first American fighter to exceed 400 mph in level flight, reaching 405 mph during testing. The Navy was ecstatic. They ordered the Corsair into production, but transforming a hot rod prototype into a combat-ready carrier fighter proved nightmarish. The problems emerged in waves, each more troubling than the last. The long nose, necessary to house that massive engine, created a blind spot forward and down that made carrier landings treacherous. Pilots couldn't see the landing signal officer during the final approach, forcing them to fly a curved pattern that left them dangerously uncoordinated near the deck. The aircraft's stall characteristics were vicious. Unlike the docile warning buffets of other fighters, the Corsair's left wing would suddenly drop without warning, often flipping the aircraft into a spin. For pilots trying to land on a carrier deck at walking speed, this was potentially lethal. The main landing gear was stiff and bouncy. Combined with a high center of gravity and powerful engine torque, this created a tendency to pogo stick down the deck, bouncing wildly after touchdown. More than one Corsair pilot watched in horror as his aircraft bounced right over the barrier cables and into parked aircraft. Oil from the engine cowling would coat the windscreen during flight, reducing visibility even further. The cockpit was cramped and uncomfortable. Hydraulic fluid leaked. The guns jammed. The list went on. By late 1942, the Navy's patience had worn thin. Despite its stunning performance in the air, the F-4U was deemed too dangerous for carrier operations. The Navy rejected it, ordering their carriers to continue flying the older, slower, but more forgiving F-6F Hellcat instead. The Corsair, designed specifically for carrier operations, would not serve on carriers. It seemed like an ignominious end for the world's fastest fighter. The bent-wing bird was too hot to handle, too dangerous to deploy, too strange to trust. But the United States Marine Corps had other ideas. Nasakar Part 2. Muddy Boots and Second Chances. The Marines. Step in the Marine Corps operated under different constraints than the Navy. Their squadrons flew from land bases, rough, muddy airstrips carved from jungles and coral islands, with none of the precision requirements of carrier decks. They could tolerate the Corsair's difficult handling characteristics in exchange for its devastating performance advantages. In late 1942, Marine Fighter Squadron 124, VMF-124, became the first operational Corsair unit, training in North Carolina under the command of Major William E. Geese. The squadron's pilots approached their new mounts with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The Corsair's reputation preceded it. Fastest fighter in the sky, most dangerous aircraft to land. Gunnery Sergeant Harold Indian Joe Bauer, one of the Marine Corps' most experienced fighter pilots, summed up the common sentiment after his first flight. It's like strapping a rocket to your ass and hoping to hell you can hang on. The learning curve was steep and occasionally fatal. The Corsair demanded respect, precision, and constant vigilance. But once mastered, it offered capabilities that made Marine pilots feel invincible. The speed, the climb rate, the diving power, the 650 caliber machine guns that could saw enemy aircraft in half. On February 12, 1943, VMF-124 departed for the forward combat zone, destination Guadalcanal. The My server, Cactus Air Force Guadalcanal, was a nightmare made real. The Americans had seized the island and its critical airfield, codenamed Henderson Field, in August 1942. But the Japanese were determined to take it back. The result was months of savage, grinding combat on the ground, at sea, and in the air. The motley collection of American squadrons defending Henderson became known as the Cactus Air Force, after the island's radio call sign. Conditions were apocalyptic. The airstrip was a muddy, bomb-cratered mess that became a swamp during tropical downpours. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever were constant companions. Japanese warships bombarded the field almost nightly, and enemy bombers arrived with predictable regularity each afternoon, so predictably that Marines called the daily raids Tojo time. Into this hell came VMF-124 and their strange, bent-wing fighters. The Corsair's size and power proved ideal for the crude conditions. Unlike carrier operations, the long takeoff runs and wide landing patterns didn't matter on Guadalcanal's extended strip. The rugged landing gear that bounced on carrier decks absorbed the punishment of potholes and coral debris without complaint. On February 14, 1943, just 2 days after arriving, VMF 124 scored its first kill. Lieutenant Kenneth A. Walsh, a former enlisted pilot who'd worked his way up through sheer determination, spotted a flight of Japanese dive bombers approaching Henderson. He firewalled his throttle, and the Corsair leapt forward with acceleration that still surprised him even after weeks of training. The Japanese pilots never saw him coming. Walsh's 6 guns converged in a devastating cone of fire, and the first bomber disintegrated. Then the second. He damaged a third before breaking off, fuel running low. Back on the ground, Walsh climbed out of his cockpit to find a growing crowd of Marines, sailors, and ground crew surrounding his aircraft. Word had already spread. The bent wing bird had drawn blood. First impressions, the initial reports from Guadalcanal electrified Marine Corps aviation. The Corsair could outrun anything the Japanese flew. It could outdive any enemy fighter. In a high-speed slashing attack, diving from altitude, firing, and using speed to escape, it was virtually untouchable. But the early combat also revealed troubling limitations. The Corsair couldn't dogfight, at least not in the traditional turning engagement that dominated Pacific air combat. The Japanese Zero, the ubiquitous enemy fighter that had terrorized Allied pilots for 18 months, could turn inside the Corsair with contemptuous ease. In a slow-speed, low-altitude turning fight, the Corsair was at a severe disadvantage. This created a tactical dilemma. American pilots had been trained to dogfight, to engage in swirling, turning combats where victory went to the most maneuverable aircraft and the most skilled pilot. The Corsair demanded a completely different approach. Boom and zoom tactics. Dive, shoot, climb, repeat. Never turn, never slow down, never give the enemy a fair fight. This was psychologically difficult. It felt like running away. It felt like cowardice, but it worked. Captain Joe Foss, already an ace with 26 kills in his Wildcat, transitioned to the Corsair in March 1943. His initial assessment was blunt. It's the fastest thing I've ever flown, and the most unforgiving. You fly it by the numbers, or it'll kill you. But if you fly it right, nothing in the Pacific can touch you. The learning process was expensive. Several Marine pilots died learning the Corsair's limits, often by getting into turning fights they couldn't win or by losing control during aggressive maneuvering. But the survivors developed tactics that exploited the aircraft's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. By mid-1943, Marine Corsair squadrons were racking up impressive kill ratios. The bent wing bird was proving itself, not on carrier decks, but in the muddy, desperate environment of forward island bases. Der Beskar, Part 3, The Zero and its Pilots. Imperial perfection. To understand the Corsair's impact, we must understand its primary opponent, the Mitsubishi A6M-0. When the Zero entered service in 1940, it was arguably the finest fighter aircraft in the world. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi under extreme weight constraints, the Zero achieved something that Western engineers thought impossible. A fighter with exceptional range, climb rate, maneuverability, and firepower. The secret was ruthless weight reduction. The Zero eliminated armor protection for the pilot. It deleted self-sealing fuel tanks. It used lightweight aluminum alloys throughout its structure. The result was an aircraft that weighed barely 3,700 pounds, empty. Roughly half the empty weight of a Corsair. This radical lightness gave the Zero supernatural maneuverability. It could turn inside any Allied fighter. Its climb rate was exceptional. Its range, nearly 2,000 miles with external tanks, allowed Japanese fighters to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, something American fighters couldn't match. In the opening months of the Pacific War, the Zero achieved legendary status. In the hands of Japan's superbly trained pre-war pilots, it seemed invincible. Allied pilots reported, often in panicked, breathless radio calls, encounters with a mysterious enemy fighter that could outmaneuver them effortlessly. The Zero became psychological warfare. American and British pilots feared it. Commanders didn't know how to fight it. Intelligence estimates wildly exaggerated its capabilities, crediting it with speeds and climb rates it didn't actually possess. But by 1943, the Zero's weaknesses were becoming apparent. The price of lightness. The Zero's lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks made it extremely vulnerable to battle damage. A single .50 caliber bullet through a fuel tank could turn it into a fireball. The lightweight structure couldn't withstand high G maneuvers at high speeds. It was designed for agile dogfighting at moderate speeds, not the high-speed combat that American fighters were forcing on it. More critically, the Zero's engine hadn't improved significantly since 1940. While American fighters rapidly increased in power and performance, the Zero remained largely static. Newer variants added armor and self-sealing tanks at the insistence of pilots who'd survived American attacks. But this additional weight degraded performance without fundamentally solving the vulnerability problem. The Zero of 1943 was fighting with 1940 capabilities against opponents that had evolved dramatically. The aces. Yet the aircraft was only part of the equation. The men who flew them mattered just as much. Japan's Naval Aviation Corps entered the war with possibly the best-trained fighter pilots in the world. Candidates endured years of brutal training that had washout rates exceeding 90%. Those who survived were hardened, skilled, and imbued with Bushido warrior ethos. Pilots like Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and Toshio Ota were aviation artists, men who could make their Zeros perform seemingly impossible maneuvers. Sakai himself was credited with over 60 aerial victories, many against numerically superior opponents. But Japan's training system had a fatal flaw. It produced brilliant pilots slowly, and it provided no mechanism to replace them when they died. There were no rotation systems. Japanese fighter pilots flew combat missions until they were killed or too sick to continue. There were no training commands stateside to cycle experienced pilots through as instructors. The veterans just kept flying, and the inevitable mathematics of aerial combat slowly eroded their numbers. By mid-1943, Japan was sending increasingly inexperienced pilots into combat. These replacement aviators had abbreviated training, months instead of years, and were facing American pilots in aircraft that negated the Zero's traditional advantages. Cultural perspectives. The Japanese military establishment initially dismissed the Corsair as another American brute force design, powerful but crude, lacking the refined elegance of Japanese engineering. This attitude reflected deeper cultural assumptions about American character. That Americans were materialistic, undisciplined, and lacked the spiritual dedication required for true martial excellence. Japanese propaganda emphasized the Zero's spiritual power, the idea that the aircraft embodied Japanese virtues of simplicity, purity, and harmony with nature. American aircraft, by contrast, were portrayed as mechanically complex and dependent on industrial might, rather than pilot skill. This narrative served multiple purposes. It bolstered morale among Japanese forces and the home population. It justified Japan's decision to go to war against a nation with vastly greater industrial capacity. And it provided a comforting explanation for early successes. Japanese victories weren't due to technological advantages, but to superior spirit and skill. The Corsair challenged this narrative directly. Here was an American fighter that wasn't just powerful. It was sophisticated. Its inverted gull wing represented advanced engineering. Its performance envelope exceeded the zeros in almost every metric except turning radius. And Marine pilots were developing tactics that exploited these advantages with cold, calculated efficiency. Japanese pilots didn't initially fear the Corsair. They mocked it. The bent wings looked comical. The aircraft's size made it seem ungainly. Early encounters often ended with Corsairs refusing to dogfight, instead diving away at speeds the Zero couldn't match, which looked like cowardice to Japanese pilots trained to value close combat and aggressive spirit. They run like rabbits, one Japanese pilot reportedly said after an engagement where Corsairs made slashing attacks and then escaped to altitude. No honor, no courage. But the kill ratios told a different story. Warren, Part 4, Learning to Fight. The Thatch Weave and beyond the Americans weren't just building better fighters, they were revolutionizing aerial tactics. Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch had developed a defensive maneuver called the Thatch Weave while flying the Wildcat against Zeros in the war's early months. The tactic involved two fighters flying parallel courses, weaving back and forth across each other's flight path. When an enemy attacked one aircraft, his partner would turn toward him, placing the attacker in his guns. The Thatch Weave exploited teamwork over individual skill. It negated the Zero's turning advantage by ensuring that no pilot ever fought alone. An enemy who tried to dogfight one American aircraft would expose himself to another. Corsair squadrons refined and expanded these tactics. The four-plane division became standard, two pairs of fighters operating cooperatively with altitude separation for mutual support. The doctrine was simple: energy management over turning fights, teamwork over individualism, boom and zoom over dogfighting. Marine pilots developed specific engagement profiles. The high side attack. Corsairs would patrol at 25,000 plus feet, where their supercharged engines gave them a decisive advantage. When enemy formations appeared below, the Marines would dive at speeds exceeding 400 mm, make a single firing pass, and use their accumulated energy to zoom back to altitude before the Zeros could react. The overhead run. Similar to the high side attack, but executed from directly above. The Corsair would roll inverted and dive vertically, guns blazing, before pulling through at the bottom and climbing away. The slash and dash. Used when Corsairs encountered enemy fighters at co-altitude. The Marines would make a quick firing pass, then use full throttle to open the distance before the enemy could close. If the Zero pursued, the Corsair's superior speed would open the gap. If the Zero tried to turn away, the Corsair could pursue. The key to all these tactics was discipline. Never turn, never slow down. Never give the enemy a chance to exploit the Zero's superior maneuverability. For pilots trained in traditional dogfighting, this required a mental revolution. It meant abandoning the instinct to follow a damaged enemy into a turn. It meant watching enemies escape because pursuit would slow you down. It meant accepting that aerial combat was now about physics and geometry, not aerial jousting. Some pilots couldn't make the adjustment. They died. Others embraced the new paradigm and became aces. WWII VMF 214, the Black Sheep, no squadron exemplified the Corsair's evolution more than Marine Fighter Squadron 214, the Black Sheep. In August 1943, Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington took command of VMF-214 and rebuilt it from scratch with replacement pilots who didn't fit anywhere else. Some were too old, some were too young. Many were washouts from other squadrons. Troublemakers, misfits, pilots with attitude problems or spotty records. Boyington himself was a living contradiction. A former flying tiger who'd fought in China before Pearl Harbor, he was technically too old for combat command at 31. He drank heavily, gambled compulsively, and regularly disobeyed orders. He was also one of the finest fighter pilots in the Marine Corps. VMF-214 arrived at Vella La Vella in the Solomon Islands in September 1943, flying war-weary Corsairs that leaked, rattled, and required constant maintenance. The squadron's maintenance chief reportedly said the aircraft were held together with baling wire and prayers. What happened next became legend. Boyington drilled his pilots relentlessly on energy tactics. He emphasized situational awareness, mutual support, and aggressive but disciplined attack. He flew as flight leader on almost every mission, demonstrating the tactics he preached. The Black Sheep tore through Japanese formations with shocking efficiency. In 84 days of combat, the squadron destroyed 203 enemy aircraft, with Boyington personally credited with 28 kills during this period, adding to his 6 from China, giving him 34 total. But Boyington's tactical genius lay not in his individual kills, but in how he employed the Corsair's unique capabilities. He understood that the bent-wing fighter was a platform for a system: altitude, speed, teamwork, communication. In Boyington's hands, the Corsair wasn't just a fighter. It was a dominant predator that controlled when, where, and how combat occurred. The technical edge. By late 1943, American intelligence had thoroughly analyzed the Zero, and American industry was responding with purpose-built Zero killers. The Corsair's design allowed continuous improvement in ways the Zeros couldn't match. Vought engineers solved the early reliability problems. They improved visibility by raising the pilot's seat and adding a bulged canopy. They strengthened the landing gear struts and improved the stall warning systems. More importantly, they upgunned the aircraft. The standard armament of 6 50-caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, could be supplemented with 8 5-inch rockets or up to 4,000 pounds of bombs, transforming the Corsair into a devastating ground attack platform. The F-4U-1C variant, introduced in late 1944, replaced the 50-caliber guns with 4 20mm cannons, giving the Corsair firepower that could destroy a Zero with a single hit. Engine development continued apace. The R-2800 progressed through multiple versions, each producing more power. Water injection systems allowed short bursts of up to 2,400 horsepower. By war's end, the Corsair could exceed 450 mph in level flight, speeds that would have seemed impossible in 1940. The Zero, meanwhile, stagnated. Attempts to develop improved versions foundered on Japan's collapsing industrial capacity and shortage of strategic materials. The A6M5 and later variants made incremental improvements, but they were fundamentally still 1940 designs trying to compete in 1944. Dover, Part 5th, The Turning Point. Rabaul, the fortress. By late 1943, the strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted decisively. American forces were advancing up the Solomon Islands chain, isolating Japanese strongholds and pushing toward the Philippines and Japan itself. The key Japanese position in the South Pacific was Rabaul, on the island of New Britain. The Japanese had transformed it into a fortress, with 4 major airfields, extensive anti-aircraft defenses, and a garrison of 100,000 troops. Nearly 400 aircraft, fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance planes operated from Rabaul's airstrips. American strategy called for neutralizing Rabaul through sustained air attack rather than direct assault. Between October 1943 and February 1944, Marine and Navy squadrons flew hundreds of missions against the fortress, trying to destroy its air power and render the base ineffective. These raids became the crucible where Corsair pilots proved their aircraft's supremacy. The Great Turkey Shoot, November 11, 1943. 70 Corsairs and Hellcats escorted a bomber strike against Rabaul's harbor facilities. Japanese commanders scrambled everything that could fly. Over 100 Zeros and other fighters rose to meet them. The resulting air battle was the largest of the South Pacific campaign. Major Greg Boyington led VMF 214 in the high cover position, 30,000 feet above the bombers. From this altitude, the Corsairs had a commanding tactical advantage. When the Japanese fighters climbed to intercept, Boyington's division dove. In his autobiography, Boyington described the sensation, "Everything was happening at once." The Corsair was screaming, literally screaming. The air over the engine intake set up that characteristic whistling howl. I pulled up on a Zero at probably 450 miles per hour. Fired a burst that started at his tail and walked right up through the cockpit. He just came apart. Below, other Corsair divisions were executing similar attacks. Dive, shoot, zoom away. The Zeros tried to turn into the attacks, exposing themselves to other Corsairs diving from above. Tried to climb after the attackers, only to find they couldn't match the Corsairs' climb rate with their energy depleted. The Japanese pilots fought bravely and skillfully. Several Corsairs were damaged, but the mathematics were brutal. For every attack a Zero made, it exposed itself to multiple counterattacks. The Americans' altitude advantage, speed advantage, and teamwork overwhelmed individual skill. The final tally: 39 Japanese aircraft destroyed, with many more damaged. The Americans lost 4 aircraft, with 2 pilots recovered. It wasn't the last big air battle over Rabaul, but it established a pattern. The Corsair squadrons could strike with impunity, dictating the terms of engagement. Japanese fighters could achieve local successes, a damaged bomber here, a shot-up fighter there. But they couldn't stop the attacks, couldn't protect their own aircraft on the ground, couldn't maintain the attrition rate. Psychological shift. The battles over Rabaul marked a fundamental shift in Japanese pilot psychology. Saburo Sakai, who survived the war to write extensively about his experiences, described encountering Corsairs in late 1943. "We called them the whistling death. You could hear them coming from the distinctive sound of air over their cowlings. My whole squadron would dive away when we heard that sound. It wasn't cowardice, we had orders to avoid combat with Corsairs unless we had overwhelming advantage in position or numbers." This was remarkable. The same pilots who dominated Allied forces for 18 months, who'd been taught that Japanese spirit could overcome any material disadvantage, were being ordered to avoid combat with a specific American aircraft. The mockery had stopped. Japanese pilots now spoke of the Corsair with respect bordering on fear. Its speed made it impossible to escape. Its diving attacks gave no time to maneuver. Its firepower destroyed aircraft with single bursts, and the pilots flying it had learned to exploit every advantage, fighting with cold tactical efficiency rather than emotional aggression. Internal Japanese documents from this period show growing alarm about the Corsair's impact. One naval aviation report from December 1943 stated, "The F-4U fighter's high speed and powerful armament make it extremely dangerous in all combat situations. Our pilots should avoid engagement when possible and attack only when holding significant altitude advantage." Another report was more blunt. "The enemy's new fighters represent a qualitative superiority we cannot match with current equipment. The propaganda about American fighters being crude and unsophisticated had collided with reality. Japanese pilots weren't dying because they lacked spirit or skill. They were dying because they were flying inferior aircraft, and their opponents had developed superior tactics. Der Versuchsturm Part 6, The Aces. Kenneth Walsh, the sergeant who became a legend, first lieutenant. Kenneth A. Walsh represented the Marine Corps at its finest. Enlisted man who'd learned to fly, worked his way up through ability and determination, and became one of the war's deadliest fighter pilots. Walsh had enlisted in 1933 at age 17 and worked as an aviation mechanic before entering flight training. By the time he transitioned to Corsairs in late 1942, he was 27 years old, ancient by fighter pilot standards, and had already served nearly a decade in the Corps. His maturity showed in his flying. Walsh was methodical, analytical, patient. He studied his aircraft's performance envelope obsessively, testing its limits in training flights that terrified observers. He knew exactly how fast the Corsair could dive before control surfaces became ineffective. He knew the precise altitude where it began to lose performance. He knew its turning radius at every speed. Most importantly, Walsh understood energy management intuitively. He fought three-dimensionally, treating altitude as a currency to be hoarded and spent wisely. On May 13, 1943, Walsh was leading a four-plane division at 25,000 feet when they spotted a large formation of Japanese bombers and fighters below. Standard doctrine called for radioing the contact and waiting for reinforcements. Walsh saw an opportunity that wouldn't last. He led his division into a nearly vertical dive, building speed past 450 Mach. The Corsairs screamed down through the formation, guns blazing. Walsh himself destroyed 3 bombers in a single pass. Before the escorting Zeros could react, the Corsairs had zoomed back to altitude, their accumulated energy carrying them up like rockets. The Japanese fighters tried to follow. Walsh watched them struggle upward, their speed bleeding off with each 100 feet. When they were at their slowest, most vulnerable state, climbing steep and slow, Walsh rolled over and dove again. 2 more kills. Walsh's tactical innovations became doctrine. The Walsh pattern, dive, shoot, zoom, assess, repeat, became standard practice for Corsair squadrons throughout the Pacific. By war's end, Walsh had 21 confirmed kills. More importantly, he'd survived years of intense combat and returned home to train the next generation of Marine fighter pilots. He received the Medal of Honor in February 1944. Ira Kepford, the reluctant warrior ensign, Ira Sr. Ike. Kepford had never wanted to be a fighter pilot. He joined the Navy in 1941, planning to be a bomber pilot. Flying seemed safer than submarine service, and he was too patriotic to avoid military service entirely. The Navy had other ideas. Kepford's exceptional scores in flight school marked him for fighters. By early 1943, he was flying Corsairs with VF-17, the Jolly Rogers, the first Navy squadron to operate Corsairs despite the type's carrier rejection. VF-17's commander, Lieutenant Commander Tommy Blackburn, recognized something special in Kepford. He was a natural deflection shooter. While most pilots struggled to estimate the correct lead angle when shooting at a moving target, Kepford seemed to do it instinctively. Kepford's first kill came on October 11, 1943, during VF-17's first combat patrol from Ondonga Airfield. The squadron jumped a formation of Japanese bombers, and Kepford methodically shot down 2 in quick succession, his bullets finding the precise point in space where his targets were going to be. But Kepford's real revelation came in a dogfight on November 11, 1943, the same day as the Big Rabaul raid. His division encountered 4 Zeros at co-altitude. Kepford's wingman was a green replacement pilot who panicked and broke formation. Suddenly, Kepford was alone, with 4 enemy fighters converging on him. Everything he'd been taught said run. The Corsair couldn't dogfight. But Kepford was trapped. The Zeros had position, and he didn't have the energy to escape upward. So he turned. But he didn't turn horizontally, trying to outmaneuver the Zeros. Instead, Kepford turned vertically, a high-G climbing barrel roll that used the Corsair's enormous engine power to maintain speed while changing position. The Zero pilots, expecting a horizontal turn, overshot. Kepford rolled out behind the formation. 4 bursts, 3 kills. The 4th Zero fled. Kepford had discovered something critical. The Corsair couldn't turn, with a Zero in the horizontal plane, but in the vertical plane, using power to maintain energy while maneuvering, it could hold its own or even dominate. The key was keeping speed above 250 mph, using the engine's power to climb while turning, and exploiting the Corsair's superior roll rate to change direction. The vertical yo-yo became another standard Corsair tactic, though few pilots could execute it as effectively as Kepford. By February 1944, Kepford had 16 confirmed kills and was the Navy's leading ace. His success attracted media attention. His hometown in Michigan held Ira Kepford Day, and he appeared on the cover of Life magazine. The Navy eventually pulled him from combat for a war bond tour, much to his relief. Unlike many fighter pilots, Kepford had never romanticized combat. He was good at it, but he didn't enjoy it. Pappy Boyington, the Maverick Major. Gregory Boyington was simultaneously the Marine Corps' greatest asset and biggest headache. By December 1943, Boyington had shot down 25 enemy aircraft during his tour with VMF-214, adding to 6 from his Flying Tiger days. He was aggressive, tactically brilliant, and inspiring to his pilots. He was also a functioning alcoholic who regularly violated regulations, ignored orders from higher command, and seemed actively trying to get himself killed. Boyington flew when he was sick, flew when he was injured, flew when he was exhausted. He led almost every mission his squadron flew, refusing to rotate to a headquarters staff position. His personal kill count became an obsession. He was closing in on Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 kills and wanted desperately to surpass it. On January 3, 1944, Boyington led a fighter sweep over Rabaul, his 26th mission during VMF-214's combat tour. The squadron was scheduled to rotate back to Australia the following week. This was supposed to be an easy final mission. Instead, it became Boyington's last. His division encountered a large formation of Zeros. The dogfight developed quickly, with aircraft scattered across 50 miles of sky. Boyington shot down his 28th enemy aircraft. Confirmed. Some accounts claim higher. Then found himself separated from his wingman, low on fuel and surrounded by enemy fighters. Multiple Zeros attacked simultaneously. Boyington's Corsair took hits in the engine and wing. He tried to dive away, the standard escape technique, but his damaged engine wouldn't produce full power. The Zeros pursued. More hits. The Corsair's engine seized. Boyington nursed it toward the water, trying to reach a location where American submarines might pick him up. 20 miles from Rabaul, the engine caught fire. He bailed out, watched his Corsair impact the ocean, and then faced a new problem. Japanese float planes were circling overhead. Boyington spent the next several hours in the water, watching the float planes watch him, before a Japanese submarine surfaced and took him prisoner. He spent the next 20 months in POW camps, surviving torture, disease, and starvation. VMF-214 returned to base, assuming he was dead. The Marine Corps held a memorial service. Boyington's mother received the telegram every military parent dreaded. Then, in August 1945, emaciated Allied POWs emerged from Japanese camps after Japan's surrender. Among them was Gregory Boyington, 70 pounds lighter but alive. He received the Medal of Honor shortly after his return. His legend had only grown in his absence. The Black Sheep's exploits, embellished with each retelling, had made Boyington a household name. He represented something Americans wanted to believe: that mavericks and misfits could be heroes, that unconventional thinking could win wars, that you didn't have to be a by-the-book officer to be an effective warrior. But Boyington himself always insisted that his success came from his aircraft as much as his skill. In his memoirs, he wrote, "The Corsair was the finest fighter plane that flew in World War II. It could outrun, outclimb, and outdive anything the Japanese had. All we had to do was fly it smart." Dumbersatz, Part 7. Tactical Evolution. The kill ratio reality. By mid-1944, the statistics were undeniable. Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons were achieving kill ratios that defied belief. The overall Corsair kill-to-loss ratio in the Pacific Theater was approximately 11.1. 11 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Corsair lost in air-to-air combat. Some squadrons did even better. VF-17 achieved a 23.1 kill ratio during its combat tour. VMF-124 ended the war with 166 confirmed kills against 8 losses. These weren't the results of superior pilots facing inferior opponents. Japanese pilots in late 1944 and 1945 were admittedly less experienced than the pre-war veterans, but many were still highly skilled. The Zaro, while obsolescent, remained dangerous in the right hands and circumstances. The kill ratio reflected something more fundamental. The Corsair had changed the nature of Pacific air combat. Speed as survival. The tactical revolution centered on a simple principle: control the engagement. Corsair pilots could choose when to fight. If they had altitude and position, they could attack. If they didn't, they could refuse combat, using speed to escape. The Zero, and later Japanese fighters like the Kai-43 Oscar and Kai-61 Tony, couldn't force engagement on an unwilling Corsair pilot. This inverted the traditional dynamic of aerial combat. Throughout history, the more maneuverable fighter held the advantage because it could stay on its opponent's tail during turning fights. But maneuverability only mattered if you could force your opponent to turn. The Corsair made turning fights optional. This didn't mean Corsair pilots never turned. Sometimes they had to defend against attacks, protect bombers, or cover damaged wingmen. But it meant they could choose their battles based on advantage rather than being drawn into every engagement. Lieutenant Colonel John L. Smith, who transitioned from Wildcats to Corsairs in 1944, described the psychological shift. In a Wildcat, when you saw zeros, you thought, "How do I survive this?" In a Corsair, you thought, "How many can I get?" It changed everything. Alvarez Curry. The thatch weave evolves. As the war progressed, the basic thatch weave evolved into increasingly sophisticated formations. The 4-plane division became standard, arranged as two-plane sections. The division leader flew in front with his wingman slightly behind and to the side. The second section flew 1,000, 2,000 feet higher and offset, providing high cover. When the division engaged enemy fighters, the sections would separate vertically, creating what pilots called a sandwich. Enemy fighters attacking the lower section would be attacked from above. Enemy fighters trying to engage the high section would be vulnerable to the lower section. Communication became critical. Radio discipline, keeping chatter minimal but information flow constant, allowed sections to coordinate without telegraphing intentions to the enemy. A simple tally-ho 6 high told your division that you'd spotted 6 enemy aircraft above, allowing them to adjust position accordingly. The Japanese tried to adapt. Some Zero pilots developed slashing vertical attacks similar to the Corsairs' boom and zoom tactics. Others tried to bait Corsairs into turning fights by feinting vulnerability. A few, recognizing they couldn't outrun Corsairs, tried to force close-range turning engagements where their maneuverability advantage would matter. But these adaptations required perfect execution against disciplined opponents. A single mistake, getting too slow, losing sight of additional enemies, misreading an opponent's energy state, was usually fatal. Verser. Ground attack evolution. By late 1944, American forces were advancing so rapidly that aerial opposition decreased. Many Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground, withdrawn to defend the home islands, or husbanded for the expected invasion of Japan. The Corsairs' role evolved. While it remained a formidable air superiority fighter, it increasingly operated as a fighter-bomber, attacking ground targets in support of advancing Allied forces. The Corsair proved even more devastating in this role than as a pure fighter. Its structural strength allowed it to carry heavy ordnance loads. Its speed made it difficult for anti-aircraft gunners to track. Its 6 machine guns, or 4 cannons, could strafe positions with withering fire, and its ability to dive nearly vertically made it an exceptional precision bomber. Marine Corsairs supported the invasions of Palayu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, attacking bunkers, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. Pilots developed tactics for destroying Japanese strongpoints that conventional bombing couldn't touch. Diving at 70-degree angles, releasing bombs at treetop altitude, pulling up through intense anti-aircraft fire. This was dangerous work. More Corsairs were lost to ground fire during the war's final year than to enemy fighters. But the aircraft's ruggedness saved many pilots. Corsairs routinely returned to base with battle damage that would have destroyed less robust aircraft. Engines shot out, control surfaces shredded, fuel tanks punctured. One famous incident involved Marine Captain Robert Klingman, who made an emergency landing on Okinawa, with his Corsair's entire tail section destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft was unflyable by conventional logic. It had no elevator control, no rudder, and was aerodynamically unstable. Klingman used differential throttle and trim to keep it vaguely straight, aimed it at the runway, and survived the ensuing crash landing with minor injuries. When ground crew examined the wreckage, they couldn't believe anyone had flown it. Klingman reportedly said, "Vought builds a hell of an airplane." Dunkirk, Part 8. The Japanese Perspective. Diary of a Zero Pilot, Japanese accounts from this period, provide sobering counterpoint to American triumphalism. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, in his post-war memoir, Samurai, described the psychological toll of facing Corsairs in 1944. The Americans had learned well. They no longer tried to dogfight us. They would dive from high altitude at tremendous speed, fire a burst, and zoom away before we could respond. If we climbed after them, they would simply continue climbing faster than we could follow. If we dove away, they would follow us down, always faster, always with position advantage. It was not a matter of courage or skill anymore. It was physics. Their aircraft were simply superior, and they had learned to exploit that superiority perfectly. Other Japanese accounts describe the demoralizing effect of the Corsair's distinctive engine sound. Multiple sources mention that Japanese ground troops and airbase personnel could identify approaching Corsairs by the unique howl created by air, passing through the oil coolers in the leading edge of the wings. This sound, which Americans found merely distinctive, became a psychological weapon. Japanese troops described it as the sound of death, a harbinger of strafing attacks or bombing runs. The mere sound could trigger panic among inexperienced troops. Tactical desperation. As Japan's strategic situation deteriorated, Japanese fighter tactics became increasingly desperate. Some Zero pilots tried to ram American bombers and fighters, deliberately sacrificing themselves to destroy an enemy aircraft. While not yet the organized kamikaze program that would emerge in late 1944, these individual ramming attacks reflected growing desperation. Other pilots tried what they called special attacks, essentially banzai charges in the air, where multiple fighters would attack from different directions simultaneously, accepting heavy losses to achieve kills. Against disciplined corsair formations flying mutual support, these attacks were suicidal and rarely effective. Japanese commanders recognized the futility. Internal documents from mid-1944 show discussions of withdrawing fighters from forward bases to preserve them for the defense of the home islands. Officers debated whether it was better to expend pilots and aircraft in delaying actions or husband resources for a final, decisive battle. The decision was made to conserve forces. By late 1944, American pilots were often flying missions without encountering any aerial opposition. The sky belonged to the United States. The Redistarters, or the Zero's last gasp. Japan's aeronautical industry attempted to develop new fighters that could challenge the Corsair and other advanced American aircraft. The Kawanishi N-1K George was a formidable design. Well-armed, armored, and with performance roughly comparable to American fighters. But production was hampered by material shortages, American bombing of factories, and quality control problems. Only about 1/400 were built. The Mitsubishi J-2M Jack was designed specifically as a high-speed interceptor to counter American bombers. It had good climb rate and heavy armament, but suffered from engine reliability problems and was produced in small numbers. None of these aircraft could reverse the strategic situation. Japan lacked the industrial capacity, fuel, and trained pilots to challenge American air supremacy by 1945. The Zero continued to serve through the war's end, but it had become obsolete. A once revolutionary design rendered obsolete by the tide of technological progress it had initially epitomized. Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero's designer, reflected after the war. When I designed the Zero, I believed I was creating something that would protect Japan. I never imagined it would lead to so much death, or that it would be rendered obsolete so quickly. War accelerates everything, including obsolescence. Part 9. The Island Hopping Campaign. Carrier operations. Finally, by early 1945, the Navy's attitude toward the Corsair had shifted dramatically. The modifications Vought had made raised pilot seat, improved canopy, better stall characteristics, stronger landing gear. WWII had addressed many of the carrier operation concerns. But more importantly, the Corsair's combat record was undeniable. Navy admirals watched Marine squadrons achieve exceptional results and wanted that capability aboard their carriers. VF-17, the Navy's original Corsair squadron, had been operating from land bases since late 1943, despite being a carrier squadron. Now, the Navy finally deployed Corsairs aboard carriers in significant numbers. In April 1945, Navy Corsairs participated in Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, flying from carriers offshore. They encountered a new and terrifying threat: kamikaze attacks. The organized kamikaze program represented Japan's ultimate admission that conventional aerial combat was unwinnable. If Japanese pilots couldn't shoot down American aircraft, they could at least ensure that their deaths accomplished something by crashing into American ships. Corsairs became the primary defense against kamikazes. Their speed allowed them to intercept incoming attackers quickly. Their heavy armament could destroy aircraft with single bursts. critical when engaging targets that only needed one hit to succeed. Their structural strength let them safely fly through debris from destroyed kamikazes. Navy Corsair pilots developed specialized tactics for kamikaze interception. They would patrol in layers at various altitudes around the fleet. When radar detected incoming raids, the Corsairs would vector to intercept, trying to destroy the kamikazes before they reached the ships. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia of VF-9 became the Navy's leading ace specifically through anti-kamikaze operations. His division developed the mowing machine tactic, 4 Corsairs flying in a carefully coordinated pattern that created overlapping fields of fire, destroying multiple kamikazes in rapid succession. Valencia's division shot down 50 Japanese aircraft in 4 days during the Okinawa campaign, many of them kamikazes that would otherwise have reached American ships. Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated the Corsairs' versatility. At Iwo Jima, Marine Corsairs provided close air support to Marines fighting on the ground. The volcanic island's terrain created unique challenges. The dark volcanic sand made targets difficult to spot, and the dense network of tunnels and fortifications required precise attacks. Corsair pilots flew missions from carriers offshore, then from Iwo's captured airfields once they were secured. They attacked bunkers, artillery positions, and cave entrances, often dropping bombs within 100 yards of friendly positions. The precision and responsiveness of Marine air support became legendary among ground Marines. A forward air controller could request an attack and have Corsairs overhead within minutes, putting ordnance on target with devastating accuracy. At Okinawa, Corsairs flew thousands of sorties over the 82-day battle. They attacked Japanese positions, intercepted kamikazes, escorted bombers, and flew combat air patrol over the fleet. Some pilots flew 3 or 4 missions per day. The Japanese defenders fought with desperate ferocity, knowing Okinawa was the last barrier before the home islands. But they had virtually no air support. American air supremacy was so complete that Japanese troops called the daylight hours American time. Moving or operating during the day was suicidal. The numbers. By war's end, the Corsairs' combat record was extraordinary. Total Corsairs built 12,571 by Vought, Goodyear, and Brewster. Japanese aircraft destroyed 2,140 confirmed, likely thousands more damaged or destroyed on the ground. Overall kill ratio, approximately 11.1. Corsair aces produced 122 pilots with 5+ aerial victories. Missions flown, estimated 64,000+. These weren't just statistics. They represented a revolution in aerial warfare. The Corsair had demonstrated that properly designed and employed technology, combined with effective tactics and training, could overcome numerical inferiority and even initial disadvantages. Numbers and Isidore. Part X, the human cost. The other side of glory. The Corsair's success came at a price that statistics don't fully capture. Marine squadrons in forward areas endured grinding conditions that took psychological and physical tolls. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever were constant companions. The heat was oppressive. Sleep was scarce. Japanese harassment raids hit air bases almost nightly, forcing pilots to dive into foxholes while their aircraft burned. Combat stress accumulated. Pilots watched friends die, sometimes in horrific ways. They saw aircraft explode, pilots burn, wingmen disappear into the ocean. Some handled it stoically. Others developed what was euphemistically called operational fatigue, what we'd now recognize as combat stress or PTSD. The Marine Corps had limited understanding of combat psychology in the 1940s. Pilots were expected to continue flying until physically unable or killed. Some squadron commanders showed remarkable sensitivity to their pilots' mental states, rotating stressed aviators to rear areas for recovery. Others pushed pilots beyond their limits. Second Lieutenant John Smith, a different John Smith from the earlier mentioned colonel, kept a diary during his tour with VMF 2922 in 1944. One entry reads, "Flew 3 missions today. Lost Henderson on the 2nd. Saw him go in after a strafing run. Didn't get out. That makes 6 from our squadron this month. Nobody talks about it. We just keep flying. What else can we do?" Smith survived the war, but never spoke about his combat experiences to his family. His diary wasn't discovered until after his death in 1987. The Japanese losses. For Japanese pilots, the situation was even grimmer. Japan's failure to rotate combat pilots meant that experienced aviators flew until they died or were too sick to continue. There was no rest, no reprieve, no rotation home for recovery. As the war progressed and American forces advanced, Japanese pilots faced impossible odds. They flew obsolescent aircraft, often without adequate fuel or ammunition. They faced numerically superior opponents with better equipment and well-developed tactics. Many Japanese pilots knew they were unlikely to survive. Letters home from this period reflect fatalistic acceptance. One Zero pilot wrote to his family in March 1945, "I have been honored to serve the Emperor and our nation. I have done my duty to the best of my ability. Please do not grieve when you receive news of my death. I will have died doing what I was trained to do." He was killed 3 days later, attacking American carriers off Okinawa. The human cost of Japan's tactical and technological failures was staggering. Thousands of skilled, brave pilots died in aircraft that couldn't compete, using tactics that no longer worked, in a war their country could not win. The survivors. For pilots who survived, the transition to peacetime was often difficult. Many Corsair pilots found civilian life mundane after the intensity of combat. They'd spent months or years living on adrenaline, where every day brought life or death challenges. Normal life seemed colorless by comparison. Some became test pilots or continued military careers. Others struggled with alcohol, relationships, or finding purpose. The Tailhook Association and Marine Corps League provided social networks where veterans could connect with others who understood their experiences. Gregory Boyington's post-war life exemplified the challenges. He received the Medal of Honor, wrote a best-selling memoir, and became famous. He also struggled with alcoholism, failed marriages, and difficulty holding employment. His wartime heroics hadn't prepared him for peace. Kenneth Walsh, by contrast, remained in the Marine Corps, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He lived quietly, rarely discussing his wartime experiences publicly. He died in 1998 at age 82, respected but not famous. Ira Kepford returned to his hometown, became a businessman, and actively avoided celebrity. When a reporter asked him about his war experiences in the 1970s, he reportedly said, "I did my job. A lot of good men didn't come home. I'd rather talk about them than myself." Versterwanost Pardohernai, Technical Legacy, Sordadars, Post-War Service. The Corsair's combat career didn't end with World War II. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, the Corsair returned to combat, now in the ground attack role almost exclusively. Marine and Navy squadrons flew F-4U-4s and F-4U-5s, improved late war variants, from carriers and airfields in Korea. The aircraft's robust construction proved ideal for close air support missions. Corsairs attacked North Korean and Chinese positions with napalm, bombs, and rockets, often flying through intense anti-aircraft fire. The Corsair faced a new threat in Korea. Jets. The MiG-15, flown by North Korean, Chinese, and Soviet pilots, was faster and more maneuverable than the aging Corsair. But jets were ineffective at low altitude for close air support, where the Corsair excelled. One notable incident occurred on September 10, 1952, when Captain Jesse G. Fulmar's Corsair was attacked by a MiG-15. Rather than fleeing, Fulmar turned into the attack and, through a combination of aggressive maneuvering and accurate shooting, damaged the MiG badly enough that it fled. It was one of the war's stranger engagements, a propeller-driven world war, a second fighter driving off a modern jet. Corsairs flew their last combat missions for the U.S. military in 1953. But the aircraft continued serving with other nations' air forces through the 1960s. France flew Corsairs in Indochina and Algeria. Honduras operated Corsairs until 1969. The Central African Republic's Air Force had flyable Corsairs into the 1970s. Though resteurs, design influence. The Corsair's design influenced post-war aircraft development in subtle but important ways. The inverted gull wing, while distinctive, wasn't widely copied. Its benefits were specific to the combination of large propeller and short landing gear. But the underlying principle, accepting unconventional configuration to optimize performance, became standard in aerospace design. The Corsair demonstrated that structural strength and performance weren't mutually exclusive. Its robust airframe that could survive heavy battle damage while maintaining high speed influenced designs like the A-10 Thunderbolt Instu, which prioritized survivability and performance in close air support roles. The aircraft's evolution from rejected carrier fighter to dominant multi-role aircraft demonstrated the value of continuous improvement. The F4U-1 of 1942 and the F4U-5 of 1945 were dramatically different aircraft in capability, yet shared the same basic airframe. This development philosophy influenced jet fighter programs. Preservation and memory. Today, approximately 30 Corsairs remain airworthy worldwide, maintained by museums, private collectors, and warbird enthusiasts. These aircraft appear at air shows, where their distinctive gull wings and characteristic engine howl still draw crowds. Pilots who fly restored Corsairs describe them as challenging, unforgiving, but immensely rewarding, the same terms their wartime predecessors used. The Plane of Fame Air Museum in California maintains a flying F4U-1A that participated in the Okinawa campaign. The Commemorative Air Force operates several Corsairs. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, displays multiple variants showing the aircraft's evolution. These preserved aircraft serve as physical connections to history, reminders of the men who flew them, the battles they fought, and the era they represent. Part 2. Cultural impact. Ba-Bay Black Sheep and popular memory. The Corsair achieved unique status in American popular culture primarily through the 1970s television series Ba-Bay Black Sheep, later retitled Black Sheep Squadron, loosely based on Gregory Boyington's memoir and VMF 214's exploits. The show, while historically inaccurate in many details, introduced the Corsair to millions of Americans who hadn't lived through World War II. The bent-wing fighter became synonymous with Marine Corps aviation and Pacific Theater air combat. This popular culture representation had complex effects. It elevated the Corsair and its pilots to legendary status, ensuring their stories wouldn't be forgotten. But it also simplified and sanitized the reality of combat, presenting aerial warfare as exciting adventure rather than deadly serious business. Real Corsair pilots had mixed reactions. Some enjoyed the recognition. Others felt the show trivialized their experiences and disrespected pilots who died. Gregory Boyington himself served as technical advisor, but grew frustrated with Hollywood's embellishments. The symbol. The Corsair became a symbol that transcended its military function. For Marines, it represented the Corps' tradition of making do with equipment other services rejected, then excelling with it. The Navy's rejection of the Corsair for carrier operations, followed by the Marine Corps' spectacular success with it, fit perfectly into Marine Corps mythology about adaptability and determination. For aviation enthusiasts, the Corsair represents a golden age of piston engine fighter design, the culmination of decades of development before jets rendered propellers obsolete. Its distinctive appearance made it instantly recognizable, an aesthetic appeal rare in military hardware. For historians, the Corsair illustrates how military technology and tactics co-evolve. The aircraft didn't revolutionize combat alone. It required new tactics, training methods, and operational concepts. The combination of technological capability and human adaptation created effectiveness greater than either component alone. Omskran, memory, and meaning. What makes the Corsair's story compelling isn't just its technical specifications or combat record. It's the narrative arc. Rejection, adaptation, domination, and vindication. The aircraft that couldn't land on carriers became the most effective fighter in the Pacific. The pilots who flew it, often misfits, troublemakers, and second choices, became aces and heroes. The tactics they developed, initially controversial and counterintuitive, became doctrine. This narrative resonates because it challenges assumptions about what success looks like. The Corsair wasn't successful despite its problems. In many ways, it was successful because of them. The difficulty of mastering it meant only determined, skilled pilots could fly it effectively. The requirement for new tactics forced innovative thinking. The rejection by the Navy led to Marine Corps' adoption, which proved ideal for the Pacific Island campaigns. Lerker-Sower, Part 3, Comparative Analysis. Corsair vs. Zero, the technical reality. By 1944, the performance gap between the F-4U Corsair and A6M0 was dramatic. Speed. Corsair, 417 mph maximum, F-4U 1A, 0, 351 mph maximum, A6M5. Advantage, Corsair by 66 mph, 19% faster. Climb rate. Corsair, 2,090 feet per minute initial. 0, 3,150 feet per minute initial. Advantage, 0, slightly. Range. Corsair, 1,015 miles. 0, one ionized ran 30 miles with drop tanks. Advantage, 0, significantly. Armament. Corsair, 650 caliber machine guns, total 2,400 rounds. 0, 2 20mm cannons, 2 7.7mm machine guns. Advantage, Corsair, volume of fire. 0, individual projectile lethality. Turning radius. Corsair, poor compared to 0, 0, excellent. Advantage, 0, significantly. Dive speed. Corsair, excellent, could exceed 500 mph. 0, poor, structural limits around 410 mph. Advantage, Corsair, significantly. Structural strength. Corsair, excellent, 6.5 G positive, 3 G negative. 0, adequate, 7 G positive, but fragile structure. Advantage, Corsair. Armor protection. Corsair, pilot armor, self-sealing tanks. 0, minimal to none. Advantage, Corsair, significantly. The specifications reveal why tactics mattered so much. In categories where the Zero excelled, turning, initial climb, range. The advantages didn't matter if the Corsair pilot refused to engage on those terms. In categories where the Corsair excelled, speed, diving, structural strength, armor, the advantages were decisive in the boom and zoom tactics American pilots employed. The Hellcat alternative. The F-6F Hellcat, the Navy's carrier fighter of choice, provides an interesting comparison to the Corsair. The Hellcat was slower than the Corsair, 391 mph per maximum, less maneuverable and less aesthetically distinctive. But it was easier to fly, easier to maintain, and more forgiving of pilot errors. The Navy's carrier squadrons flew Hellcats throughout the war and achieved excellent results. A 19.1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. The Hellcat versus Corsair debate continues among aviation enthusiasts. Statistically, the Hellcat's kill ratio was higher, though this partially reflects that Hellcat squadrons encountered more targets. They operated from carriers in the main fleet actions. The Corsair was probably the better pure fighter, but the Hellcat was the better carrier fighter until the Corsair's problems were solved. Ultimately, both aircraft were excellent, and the U.S. had the luxury of producing both in massive quantities. Japan, by contrast, could barely produce enough Zeros to replace combat losses, let alone develop and manufacture improved types in significant numbers. Nostrils. Epilogue. From Mockery to Mastery. Okinawa, May 1945. The Japanese pilot was 19 years old and had 120 hours of flight training, barely enough to qualify for solo flight in peacetime. He'd been in combat for 3 weeks and had never scored a kill. His Zero was showing oil pressure problems, and he suspected the engine wouldn't last another mission. Above him, a division of 4 Corsairs circled at 25,000 feet, their bent wings catching the late afternoon sun. He'd been ordered to avoid them, to focus on the American bombers approaching from the east. But the bombers had their own fighter escort, and his squadron had already lost 2 aircraft trying to reach them. The young Z-Hitch pilot knew this would probably be his last flight. His fuel was running low, his engine was failing, and there were American fighters everywhere. The sky that had once belonged to Japan now belonged to its enemies. He thought about the stories the veterans used to tell, back when there were veterans. Tales of the early war when Zeros dominated the sky, when American fighters fled at their approach. Those days seemed like myths now, stories from another world. The Corsairs above continued their lazy circles, confident and untouchable. The young pilot pushed his stick forward and dove away, heading back toward base. There was no point dying for nothing. He wouldn't make it. An hour later, his engine seized completely, and he ditched in the ocean. American submarines picked him up 2 days later. He survived the war. In his post-war testimony to American intelligence officers, he was asked what he thought about the Corsair. "We were told it was just another American fighter," he said, "powerful but crude. We thought we could outfly them with superior skill and spirit. And we were wrong about everything." Narsimurtis. Conclusion: The legacy of the bent-wing bird. The F-4U Corsair's story transcends aviation history. It's a case study in innovation, adaptation, and the complex relationship between technology and human skill. The aircraft that Japanese pilots initially mocked became their nemesis, not because American pilots were necessarily more skilled, though American training was superior, but because the Americans developed tactics that exploited technological advantages while minimizing disadvantages. The Corsair demonstrated that, in warfare, perception matters less than reality. It didn't matter that the bent wings looked strange or that the aircraft had been rejected by the Navy. What mattered was that in the hands of properly trained pilots using appropriate tactics, it was devastatingly effective. The Japanese laughter stopped because mockery doesn't win wars. Performance does. Tactics do. Industrial capacity does. Training does. By 1944, America led in all these categories, and the Corsair exemplified that multifaceted superiority. But the Corsair's legacy isn't just about American triumph. It's also a reminder of war's human cost. For every statistic in the 11-1 kill ratio, there was a pilot, American or Japanese, who died violently, often painfully, far from home. The Corsair's effectiveness meant more American pilots survived, but it also meant thousands of Japanese pilots died, many of them young men with no choice about their service. The aircraft sits in museums now, preserved as a historical artifact. Air show crowds watch restored Corsairs perform, hearing that distinctive whistle, seeing those bent wings cut through the sky. They represent an era when the outcome of battles could still be influenced by individual pilots in single-seat fighters, when skill and courage still mattered, alongside industrial might. The Corsair's dominance marked both an apex and an ending. It represented the pinnacle of piston-engine fighter design, the culmination of decades of development. Within a few years, jets would render propeller-driven fighters obsolete. The age of the dogfight, of visual range combat between individual pilots, was ending. But for those years in the Pacific, from 1943 to 1945, the bent-wing bird owned the sky. Japanese aces had laughed at its strange appearance, its unconventional design, its rejection by the Navy. The laughter echoed across the Pacific in early 1943, when Zero pilots still believed their superior skill and spirit would overcome American material advantages. By 1945, the laughter had stopped. The Corsair had spoken, and its message was written in the wreckage of hundreds of Japanese aircraft scattered across the Pacific. The bent wings dominated because they represented more than just an aircraft. They represented American industrial capacity, tactical innovation, pilot training, and the willingness to learn from mistakes. They represented the difference between fighting the war you wished you were fighting and fighting the war that actually existed. In the end, reality doesn't care about mockery. It only cares about what works. The Corsair worked. This narrative is based on historical records, pilot memoirs, combat reports, and post-war analyses. While dialogue has been recreated based on documented accounts and period testimony, the events described are historically accurate to the best available evidence. The men who flew the Corsair, and those who flew against it, deserve to have their stories told with respect for their courage, skill, and sacrifice on both sides of the conflict.